Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It is yet another big day in the diary of the Prime Minister, who is under increasing pressure from all sides. After a reportedly stormy cabinet meeting yesterday, Mrs May will face some of her staunchest critics on the Conservative backbenches later when she appears before MPs on the influential 1922 committee. We understand she'll attempt to convince them that she can secure a Brexit deal and get it through Parliament, whilst facing growing speculation that the same MPs could be about to force a vote of confidence in her leadership. Before all that, of course, at noon, the small matter of Prime Minister's questions in the Commons. Well, with me, our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. A busy and testing day for Mrs May.
Yes, busy and testing day. She wasn't intending to go to the 1922 committee tonight. They suddenly changed their minds yesterday.
Well, a bit of an argument about that,
yes.
Isn't it? Because Downing Street is saying she asked to go, she wasn't summoned.
Yes, well, on Monday, what we were told is that Brandon Lewis had been invited, the party chairman had been invited. Yesterday, they said that she decided to go and address MPs. And I think that suggests that the mood has shifted a little bit over the last couple of days. They wouldn't be sending her there unless they could expect a decent show of support. And MPs I've spoken to this morning, both Remainers, Brexiteers, say that she can expect some support at that meeting. We're not talking about booing and hissing showdown. So Theresa May will be going to try and do a rallying cry and say this is the final straight with the Brexit deal, but there's no getting away from the fact that although there'll be a lot of banging of tables, especially knowing that journalists like us are going to be outside, the fundamentals of Brexit haven't actually changed. I think some of those briefings at the weekend that she could bring her own noose, entering the killing zone, the backlash against those comments has probably helped build a bit of support for her. But it's pretty clear from yesterday's cabinet meeting that the issue of the backstop is still pretty intractable. There are deep concerns about whether she can get a deal over the line in the next few weeks and what the implications could be of no deal. So I think there'll certainly be some pointed questions for her today.
Well, on that, the EU's Brexit coordinator, Guy Verhofstadt, has just intervened on Twitter, not entirely helpfully. What he says is progress on the Brexit negotiations can be 90%, 95% or even 99%. But as long as there is no solution to the Irish border, as long as the Good Friday Agreement is not fully secured, for us in our Parliament, progress is 0%. And that, of course, is the European Parliament he's talking about.
Just what Number 10 were hoping to hear, I'm sure, this morning, 0% progress. Now, I think he's having a bit of mischief here. We know that the EU's view is nothing's agreed till everything is agreed, but even the likes of Michel Barnier have said he thinks they're 90 or so % of the way there. But the problem for Theresa May is a lot of MPs are deeply sceptical that they're 95% of the way there, or indeed that the no-deal preparations are as advanced as the government is saying they are, because on this issue of the backstop, there is a real division. I was speaking to a cabinet source just this morning who was saying that the cabinet were told yesterday by the Attorney General that the legal advice is there's nothing much they can do about the backstop in terms of getting an end date to it, even though that is what Mrs May's senior cabinet ministers and indeed the Prime Minister herself are pressing for. So while there's this intense work going on the backstop, it's still not clear where it will end up. And I think comments like this from Guy Verhofstadt just show how much pressure they're all under to get this agreement.
Tamara, thank you very much indeed. Well, with me now is the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen. He is one of those who's told us that he has written asking for a vote of confidence in her. Andrew Bridgen, first of all, what sort of reception do you think Mrs May's like to get from your colleagues, you and your colleagues, this evening?
Oh, I'm sure the whips and the payroll will organise it. It'll have all the political spontaneity of a Ceausescu rally tonight. It'll be well choreographed and there'll be plenty of cheering.
You could speak up and say it's time for you to go. Do you plan on doing that?
I'm not sure I'm even going to attend. I think I've heard what the Prime Minister's got to say. I'm of the opinion we either chuck checkers or we're not going to get Brexit. It's clear, I think, to colleagues now that the Prime Minister is determined to push through checkers in the face of huge opposition from our own benches. And so, you know, I've put a letter of no confidence in some time ago. I think we're very close to 48 letters.
Why do you say that? Because we don't know. I mean, what makes you think that?
The nervousness of the whips. And we've heard stories that, you know, Theresa May welcomes a vote of no confidence because she could survive it and then she couldn't be challenged for 12 months. Well, I mean, it would be the easiest political manoeuvring for the Prime Minister to arrange 30, 40 of her payroll to put an anonymous letter in and engineer the vote of confidence and survive it. I don't think number 10 want that, but I think that's where we're heading, and I think we're heading there this week.
Of course, the other issue is whether it's in the national interest to have a Conservative leadership contest now, which could take several months at a time when I think we're less than 160 days away from Brexit.
Well, we're not, are we? We're not going to be Brexiting in 160 days. We're going to go into transitional, almost certainly.
Don't have a deal, we're not.
Well, we're not going to get a deal that's acceptable, that's going to go through the House of Commons on the Chequers proposals anyway. So what we need to do is reset.
That means we would be leaving on the 29th of March next year. I mean, I mean, you disagree with the deal the Prime Minister's going for. If we're left with no deal, that becomes more likely. And I repeat my question, in those short circumstances, is it a good idea to have a leadership election and effectively no Prime Minister? Well,
we will have a caretaker Prime Minister while that's going on.
Well, be Mrs May, won't it?
Indeed. But what we'll have, I believe, will be the 1922 would truncate the leadership election so that we can quickly get a new leader into position. And then we can switch to Super Canada. We were offered this deal by President Tusk. It's on the table. We sort out the Irish border. The fact about the Irish border, this is being used as a political football. The political reality, and everybody knows it, is that the UK will never enforce a hard border on the island of Ireland, however we leave, even with no deal or WTO. The Irish Republic will never enforce a hard border on the island of Ireland, and neither the UK nor the Irish Republic will allow the EU to enforce a hard border. The answer is technology, and we need to get on with it.
I mean, the problem with that is that it's quite clear in WTO rules, for example, that if we were on that sort of trading relationship, or indeed on Canada, there would, within those rules, need to be a border. It's also the case, isn't it, that what they're saying in Brussels, as we saw from Guy Verhofstadt, is that they want to uphold the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, that's what he said.
Well, he can say what he wants. What the last thing?
Do you want to uphold the Good Friday Agreement?
Of course I do, but there's no mention of hardly any mention of the European Union or the border hardly in the Good Friday Agreement.
There is mention of the European Union.
But what the European Union are desperately seeking to avoid is the good people of the Republic of Ireland, who are still in the European Union, looking across a virtual border into Northern Ireland, a land of milk and honey, where we've got free trade deals with countries around the world, including the USA, which is the Republic of Ireland's largest trading partner, that they can't join into, because what they know is that the Republic of Ireland will be leaving the European Union very, very quickly. Even faster, if the EU enforce a hard border.
So you believe the Republic of Ireland is going to leave the EU?
If we get out of the European Union and we can do free trade deals, it will be irresistible for lots of reasons. The Republic of Ireland become a net contributor for the first time when we leave. They've got major problems that their corporation tax has been very useful for their economy, are far lower than the EU want. They want harmonisation, so they'll be forced to raise their corporation taxes. And also, I mean, this European army project, the Republic of Ireland are a neutral country, Adam. They'll have to have a referendum, I believe, to change their constitution to supply troops to a European army. That's going to cause them a major headache.
Why aren't you going to go to the meeting this evening? You've obviously got very strong opinions. I mean, shouldn't they be? I
haven't decided yet, but there will be an awful. It's not what Conservative MPs say at the 1922. It's what they're thinking in private, and some of the hypocrisy does stick in my craw a bit.
What do you mean by that?
That there's lots of people will be cheering the Prime Minister who privately will be criticising her, and I don't put myself in that boat, to be honest.
Just to clear it up, Tim Shipman, the political editor of the Sunday Times, made it clear that when he quoted unnamed Tory MPs talking about nooses and warm knives waiting for the Prime Minister, that was not you.
It was not me, and I've thought about it, and the only person or the only people that suited those sort of comments, which were very unhelpful, bad politics, and have got a lot of sympathy for the Prime Minister, is number 10. I wouldn't be surprised if number 10 didn't put those words out themselves, knowing exactly the way that the press and the public would react.
You don't think that
no.
genuine Brexiteers or opponents of Mrs May are saying things like that?
Even her most ardent critics, I can't find anyone who would have said that.
And what's the worst thing you've ever said about Mrs May?
What's the worst thing? My quote at the weekend was that we're going to this week that the Prime Minister Theresa May is drinking in the Last Chance saloon, and the bad news for her is that the bar's already dry, Adam.
OK, Andrew Bridgen, thank you very much indeed. Brexit, of course, continues to dominate the government's agenda and Theresa May's diary. Mrs May will defend her negotiation strategy later when she faces her backbench critics on the 1922 committee, in a meeting that could have big implications for her future. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but first let's just remind ourselves of where we are on Brexit and how we got here. On the 23rd of June 2016, 52% of the UK electorate voted to leave the European Union. And 9 months later, Theresa May triggered Article 50, which gives the UK 2 years to reach an agreement on withdrawal or leave without a deal. When the Prime Minister delivered her key Brexit speech in Florence, she offered a transition period, during which time the United Kingdom wouldn't participate in EU decision-making, but would still respect EU rules. The draft agreement, published in March, stated that the transition period would last until December 2020 at the latest. Other areas of agreement included citizens' rights, whereby EU nationals resident in the UK and UK nationals resident in the other European Union member states would acquire permanent residence rights after 5 years continuous lawful residence. A financial settlement of between £35 and £39 billion was also agreed. But issues relating to the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland are proving the most difficult to negotiate. The EU says if the UK can't propose specific solutions to prevent a hard border, then Northern Ireland must stay in the customs union and single market. This is the so-called backstop. Last week, Mrs May said she could accept an extension to the post-Brexit transition period. The UK is due to leave the EU on the 29th of March next year. That's when the transition would begin, along with trade talks. If a full trade deal isn't agreed by December 2020, the transition period could be extended and the backstop provision will continue unless a new arrangement is implemented. So that means a full Brexit could be delayed until the mid-2020s. So, where does this leave the Prime Minister? Is she going to be ousted by her own party? Joining me to discuss that are Nigel Evans, who's an executive member of the 1922 committee, the group of Conservative MPs which is meeting tonight to hear from the Prime Minister, Simon Hart, Conservative MP and leader of the Brexit Delivery Group, and Isabel Hardman, who's assistant editor of The Spectator and follows these matters closely. And Isabel, let's talk first of all about Mrs May. How thin is the ice she's on right now?
Well, I think, having spoken to lots of Conservative MPs over the past few days, I think the greatest fear amongst many of them is that there will be a vote of no confidence by accident, so that actually the 48 letters will go into Graham Brady calling for this vote, but that there won't be a plan behind that. So even those who want her gone accept that you need to have a really good, well-planned campaign to remove her in that vote of no confidence. And that's a much harder matter than getting just 48 letters, because you need to get a majority of Conservative MPs to vote against her, and there just isn't that majority yet. And those who want to remove her haven't yet prepared the ground. So in a sense, they're not in a rush to do it either, but there are so many different factions within the party and so many different reasons for people putting letters in which are nothing to do with Brexit and to do with their own personal gripes against the Prime Minister, that Graham Brady may well open his safe one morning and find 48 letters in there.
How thin's the ice, do you think, Nigel?
I think Isabel's just got it spot on, to be honest. Only Graham knows how many letters there are, that's for certain. And we know from people who've gone public over the last 2 to 3 days that there are other letters that have been sent in. But do I think that it's going to happen? I don't think so.
You're not a fan of checkers.
I'm not a fan of checkers,
but
no, but I'm a fan of Theresa's.
You don't want a leadership contest.
I don't want a leadership contest. I think that would be a disaster, and you're quite right that should 48 letters miraculously get in somehow or other, my own view is that Theresa then would win that vote of confidence.
I mean, Simon Hart, there are even some people saying it might be quite helpful. Andrew Bridgen saying perhaps even supporters of Mrs May will put in letters so she can win a vote.
Well, no, I think there are two reasons why that is not a very sensible idea. Partly because I think everybody who's following this, every voter who's following this, is expecting us to behave in a sober, resilient, measured and professional way, and pushing the Prime Minister overboard in the final stage of the negotiation to has not really matched that. But the other thing is this, is actually what does it change? There is still only a parliamentary majority, I think, of 11, of which 10 are the DUP. All of the problems that we're discussing around Brexit, all of the difficulties, all of the tensions will remain. So whoever takes over hasn't suddenly got some sort of magic pill they can administer and resolve everything. So actually it would look like a very self-indulgent act and actually change nothing.
But the problem for you, if you like, is that if Mrs May continues on her present course, which she seems pretty wedded to, you're going to end up in a position of either bringing her down by not letting a deal get through Parliament or supporting something you don't agree with.
No, don't forget the Prime Minister had her Florence red lines, which you helpfully, going back to June 23rd...
The red lines were Lancashire House.
Well, all right, well, anyway, the Prime Minister has managed, as we know, she dances incredibly well, so she pivoted away from that as it evolved into what it currently is. And I think if I'm reading the situation right, Adam, Barnier has effectively said that Chequers is dead. There are certain things there that they simply cannot accept. And so the negotiation, which is ongoing, is going to be important for me. The bit that I'm really still a little bit unclear about is that when we leave on the 29th of March next year, we've got this 20-month transition period. And now talking about extending that, there are two things. One is that's going to cost us billions of pounds more. And secondly, what will it achieve that can't be already achieved within the 20-month period of implementation? If Northern Ireland is a sticking block, which to me is a sticking block because politically it's a sticking block because they don't want to do anything about it, because they can keep hitting us over the head with that stick. A solution can be found.
We did proceed with lack of consideration.
But a solution can be found to that. Right. We've got new technology, we can ensure trusted trader schemes, all that sort of stuff. Once that disappears, we can go on to the free trade agreement with the European Union.
Isabel, can you see a deal that can get through the House of Commons?
It is quite difficult. I think one of the sort of dynamics for a future leadership contest, even if May stays on until, just gone March 2019, is that a lot of MPs expect there to be the chance to amend the deal further as things go on over the next few years. And so any leadership contender who was hoping that March 2019 would mean they don't have to talk about Brexit and they don't have to alienate one wing of the party is feeling sorely disappointed at the moment. And there are some cabinet ministers, for instance, Jeremy Hunt, who sort of was initially trying to kind of please both groups, but now is realising, I think, that he'll have to talk about Brexit if he becomes Conservative leader. And actually, you're going to have to take a position because people are going to ask you about this in a leadership contest in a way that a lot of those contenders had hoped they wouldn't be.
I think the question about transition was interesting, because I think we've been a member of the European Union for 43 years. If we have to be a member for 43 years and 6 months in order to get a deal, I think most people will look at 45. But I think people are looking at that in a reasonably pragmatic way. I don't think colleagues necessarily. I think that the danger that I'm seeing, it's from my sort of position on the boundary, is that unless we're really careful, we are actually going to end up with everybody falling short of where they want to be, because we are busily at the moment rejecting every possible suggestion which is coming forward. The consequence of that, and my fear for people either side of this argument, is that we end up
with no deal by accident.
No deal, which I think has huge parliamentary resistance to it, or even the only thing left standing might be another referendum, which, by the way, probably couldn't take place till 2020, and which would cause uncertainty, and which isn't necessarily the solution that everybody or some people think that it is.
And in the meantime, a third of the cabinet will have obesity problems because of the pizza that they are eating.
But how worried are you about no deal, either happening and the consequences thereof?
Well, I would prefer to have this free trade deal that Barnier did mention Canada Plus, but he wanted to do that just for Great Britain and not Northern Ireland. Well, that's clearly not going to happen. We're not going to have the border running down the Irish Sea. That's absolutely certain. Then they're talking about, well, there's going to be a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Well, I'm wondering who's going to build that, because maybe it's going to be Donald Trump and the Mexicans are going to do it and pay for it, because nobody else appears to want that to happen. So a solution needs to be looked at, and I think Theresa is absolutely right to talk about the United Kingdom as one whole, and that's what the solution has got to be.
Would you now say, in the end, that you think no deal would be so bad if we get to that point, because, you know, we've heard what the French are saying, we get daily reports from government bodies and the rest, that you in the end would support a deal and a transition rather than that, in the interest of your constituents?
You know, I've got no problem, by the way, with a no trade deal if that's what it takes at the end, Adam, because that's how we trade with the United States of America and the vast majority of countries around the world.
Would you vote to stop that?
I don't even recognise cliff edge either. I think World Trade Organization rules, there's no problem with that, but I would prefer to have a free trade deal with the European Union. I was talking today with the Chilean ambassador, talking about rolling over the Chilean trade deal that they have with the EU, with the UK. All of these can happen.
Do you think that's going to be the choice he gets in the end?
I mean, I think it's interesting that the Cabinet is now going to get weekly updates from Dominic Raab on no-deal preparations. And perhaps that's because actually the no-deal preparations are still quite far behind, or perhaps it's because there's a recognition in government that no deal is becoming increasingly likely.
But they are telling us, just about every authority in this country and the EU, that no deal would be pretty bad.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that would hold back actually Brexiteers, is that the preparations have been so bad for no deal so far that actually even if no deal had been well planned for and could be a smooth transition, it will look like chaos in those days after Brexit.
Do you think it's a fault of lack of preparation?
Well, I, as far as I can tell, although the process is subject to a bit of debate, there is no parliamentary majority for no deal, and if Parliament expressed a cross-party opinion that no way to no deal, then actually this is just a hypothetical conversation.
What would have to happen then? I mean, Parliament would have to
well,
vote
I think
for
what will happen then, as I said, I think that actually there are lots of different. There are lots of different. Well, this is the point. I think there are lots of different options.
There was a people's vote 2 years ago.
But I think at that moment, actually, there are various different options. People mentioned Norway, Canada, no deal, second referendum, all of these different variations on the theme. And actually, that's why I said earlier on, where we end up is almost in the worst of all worlds, because we've actually rigidly dismissed all of the logical attempts to broker this in the first place, and we end up in the place we don't want.
What do you think of Nigel's idea of Canada Plus?
Well, I mean, it's interesting how there are geographical variations. I represent a seat in West Wales. You know, agriculture is a big deal. Agriculture in my part of the world was very happy with Chequers. It is terrified by the prospect of no deal. So it might not be the same where Nigel is, but where I am, if I'm to represent constituents sort of reasonably, I have to take that into account. And this idea that everybody voted across the country for the same reason with the same degree of passion is palpably nonsense. And in my part of the world, that would be a really bad outcome.
OK, we will leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.
What about Mrs May's position? Will she survive to Christmas? Will she survive through the Article 50 process into spring? Will she survive into the summer?
Well, we can see she has formidable powers of survival. I would say they are her most political, her biggest political asset is her power of survival, her resilience. So who knows? I mean, the woman is extremely tenacious. But what she's had two strokes of fortune. In fact, one stroke of fortune, really, which is Jeremy Corbyn, because he has spooked everybody into the fear that a general election might bring him to power. But her second stroke of fortune is the unutterable awfulness of her party, which is institutionally programmed to knife each other in the front and back and themselves in the head. And as a result, they can't decide who they want to replace her. They can't decide whether they should replace her in principle. They can't decide whether, however awful we think she is, she will eventually do the deed and bring us out. They can't decide that. They are all over the place. They have no leadership. They have no leader. And that's why she's been able to remain in power.
But I can't remember a time when the Tories did get rid of their leader, and they do it quite often, unlike Labour. They are quite efficient at that. I can't remember a time when they got rid of a leader and there was an agreement on who the successor would be. That was true when they got rid of Mrs Thatcher. It was true when they got rid of Ted
No, but they can't decide even whether she should be got rid of.
That's for the reason that there are so many competitors, and it's quite extraordinary how they're behaving. Because even the people you might regard, for instance, in yesterday's cabinet meeting, as the more sensibles, like Jeremy Hunt or Sajid Javid, end up taking a more extreme position, because they are both contenders, a more extreme position, for instance, on the being anti-backstop, which is a kind of Chucker said, a kind of mad obsession, just because they know that the people who will elect them will be this very small group of Conservative Brexiteer members around the country. And so, as a result, everything is stuck because of the nature of the dwindling Tory party.
But do you think she will survive through Christmas?
I think she'll survive for that reason, because I think...
Does she survive after Brexit? By that I mean after the Article 50.
There is no after Brexit.
I was just defining what I meant by that. After the Article 50 process comes to an end.
Possibly.
Possibly.
I think, again, this balance of these ferocious competitors all wanting a crown. Why anybody wants it, why it looks desirable is beyond me.
Well, the truth is, I think you're being too generous to them, actually, Melanie, because I think part of the reason they're not moving, and the way you hear them talk about her, I spoke to one of your colleagues in the ERG yesterday, he said, oh, she's just our puppet, and started doing that. I was like, this is your Prime Minister. You're talking to me, a Labour MP, about your Prime Minister like this, but the key thing is...
the case.
Well, the key thing is, let me tell you this, is that if they were to replace her with, say, a more right-wing contender in the ERG, they are less likely to be able to get the parliamentary arithmetic to line up behind their proposition. And the thing that I find extraordinary, this point's not made to you guys, when Steve Baker resigned as the junior Brexit minister, he said in his first paragraph of his letter that the ERG do not have the arithmetic for the proposition they're trying to force on the Prime Minister in the Commons. And this is ultimately why these people will huff and they will puff, but they won't blow the house down, because they haven't got the numbers.
Let me ask the one Conservative MP here. How would you categorise the status of Mrs May's leadership at the moment?
I think the discussions are making everything extremely fractious, but I think she is incredibly resilient. I think she's made stern stuff. This is hard going by any standards, the negotiations and trying to bring, a parliament with her. In a very complex arrangement. I hope very much that she will absolutely make it beyond Article 50. I'd like to see her deliver a Brexit that can actually be taken through, and the country will know that she has done what was asked of us. She didn't put the referendum to the country, the previous Prime Minister did, but she has taken up the challenge to actually deliver it, and I would really, I would be thrilled if it can be her who can deliver it.
You will not be thrilled with the result for the reasons that Tucker says.
It will not be a perfect anything by definition. That's how politics works.
You won't get what you're going on to, the obsession about this backstop. She will have to sign up to it.
What needs to be...
In which case, you of the ERG will all be making a lot of noise going on after.
It must be a real Brexit. Now, I'm not
clean, pure, ideological.
Have you got the numbers in the House of Commons for the kind of Brexit you want?
We have to deliver what the British people asked for.
That's not the question I asked. Do you have the numbers?
That is the first question. We have to always remember that.
Do you have the numbers?
We chose to run a referendum. It was supported in Parliament, and we put it to the people, and they gave us a response.
But for your form of Brexit, do you think someone is more likely, say the alternatives that are mentioned, Boris, etc., do you think they have a greater chance of getting the numbers you need for your kind of Brexit through the House of Commons over Theresa May?
The kind of Brexit that the ERG wanted, in that terminology, is those who have always been Brexiteers who felt that the EU was not a place we wanted our country to be.
Have you got the numbers?
Is to
That's
actually
my third time
persuade everyone that the answer is...
Now you know how I feel.
Are we delivering?
I'm not getting an answer.
Whatever the final negotiation result is, are we delivering a real Brexit?
Have you got the numbers?
Well, I would hope that some of your party would support it if it's a real Brexit.
Have you got the numbers?
Well, we don't know what the deal is.
Have you got the numbers for people's vote?
I've answered the question and said not at the moment. Okay. Have you got the numbers?
Well, until we
You're
have
the one threatening to get rid of her.
Until we have the final deal on which to make a decision, nobody knows anything. This is one of the great challenges for the poor Prime Minister.
He's asked you 5 times.
Till we get that.
People make up their own mind. 3 is usually enough. But I'm happy to give you some I'll give you some masterclasses in this.
Until we have the deal, I can't tell you the
you
answer.
said that 3 times. You lose the will to live after a while. Let me ask you this. If there was a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, I don't mean a vote in the House on the government, but on the Prime Minister under Tory leadership rules, how would you vote?
I think she would survive.
I didn't ask you that. How would you vote?
I don't know. At the moment, I would continue to support her. We'll see how it goes. As ever, I come back to the point, we need to deliver a negotiated deal which is delivering a real Brexit. If she doesn't do that, I would be challenged to support her. But at the moment,
on that wholehearted endorsement of the Prime Minister from a Conservative backbencher, and joining me in their very own circle of hell, that is the Politics Live studio, the Conservative MP, member of the European Research Group. So I think we can take it. She's quite Eurosceptic, and Marie Trevelyan, the Labour MP and People's Vote campaign. That's why I can think we can take it. He's a Remainer. Choka Omuna. Melanie Phillips from The Times, and Polly Toynbee of The Guardian, one of journalism's most famous double acts. Welcome to you all. Now, let's just have a look at this headline, speaking of The Times. This Brexit transition period could last for years, Cabinet warned. This is a paper The Times seems to have got a hold of, an official paper, saying that the transition period could be indefinite. Which circle of hell, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, would that leave you in?
I don't think anybody wants Brexit gone forever. The voters said, please take us out. It's this government's job, therefore, to do that, and that's what we must do. We must do it promptly.
So why are you making such a Horlicks of it?
Well, I'm not in the inner circle that is the one doing the legwork.
The inner circle of hell.
well, whatever you want to call it.
So there's now an outer circle of hell and an inner circle of hell.
Well, there's the inner circle of negotiation, which is one of the most, someone who used to buy and sell companies for a living, the idea that you have to do any negotiation in the public space without giving any details away over 2 years is a ludicrous concept to have to do, but it is the nature of this beast.
So could you live with the idea that the transition period would be indefinite?
No.
Chucky, you probably could, couldn't you? Because that would kind of keep us in.
If it's on customs union and single market membership terms, I'd be quite happy with that. I wanted that permanently. Of course, my primary position is I'd like to have a people's vote on the whole thing. I think the problem that Anne-Marie's got, and in some respects you could say the same of me, is that there is no, I think, there's no majority in the House of Commons for us to leave with no deal at all. And I don't believe there is a majority for the proposition that Anne-Marie and 39 of her Conservative colleagues put forward for a kind of an extreme break, Canada-style deal. I think in certain circumstances there could be a majority for a people's vote in the House of Commons. But the problem is if you've got impasse, I don't see how you resolve this issue if not by referring it back to the people.
That's how you hope it'll be thrown back to another referendum.
Well, that's the path, if you like. Obviously, 700,000 people on the streets of London from all parts of the UK saying, look, we don't think that the likes of Chuka and Anne-Marie should be the only ones who get a say on this thing. We actually want a say on the deal. And Anne-Marie's right, if you look at the original referendum, that was a binary choice, leave or remain. But the big problem is that the form of Brexit, the final form of what this thing looks like, wasn't put to the people. And you've got, for example... Well, it is true, because otherwise...
The Prime Minister at the time was very clear that it would mean coming out of the single market, coming out of customs union. It was written in black and white. He kept saying it.
But look, it wasn't, in the end, put to people on a ballot paper. And if it was, you and I wouldn't be having the discussion right now. Never mind the fact that over 2 million young people, who this is going to affect more than any other group, haven't had a say on this at all.
OK. Melanie, are we heading for a second referendum if Parliament cannot see a way through the thickets?
It's possible, but I think that ultimately, in a democracy, which we still are, ultimately the people's opinions matter a great deal in terms of members of Parliament. I mean, you're quite right to say there's apparently no majority among members of Parliament for a no deal, but members of Parliament are going to be very, very keen to know what their voters are saying to them. And of course the balance in the country is very different, and no one quite knows where people now are on this issue. Everyone basically has lost the will to live when you mention Brexit. But to put the question to the people again in a referendum, I think would enrage a lot of people, including some Remainers, because, the people had a vote. That was the referendum. And while it's perfectly correct to say that the details of what's now emerged weren't available at the time for obvious reasons, you could say the same about any general election.
Absolutely.
If half of us knew what governments would be up to once we'd elected them, we wouldn't have elected them.
But that's why we have regular general elections.
So we do have general elections.
You have general elections, but you don't have a re-vote every
Okay.
time someone makes a decision.
But, Polly, you, I think, were against the second referendum at one stage. Is that still your view?
No, I'm in favour of one because I think
You were against?
I was wary of it in the beginning. I'm still alarmed in some ways. I still don't think it's where we should be at, but it's maybe where
You wrote in 2017, never try another referendum.
Well, except possibly this one.
That's not what you wrote.
Let me say, I think there is another option coming up quite fast, which is getting not enough coverage. The Nick Bowles, I suspect, supported by Michael Gove, who's being rather quiet, which is to stay for the time being in the EEA and in EFTA, a Norway type, but not exactly the same, so that we are out of fisheries, out of agriculture. We are in, but temporarily, still in the single market and still in the customs union.
Okay.
It avoids all of the appalling problems that are confronting us now, day after day. Official sources producing, look at the Financial Times front page, more and more horrific scenarios of what could happen if we get no deal by accident.
The referendum.
I just want to...
well, that turned out to be right. It was only just wrong in its timescale.
We were going to lose hundreds of thousands of jobs. It was going to be a disaster. Third World War was going to come.
We've lost the 2.5% they said.
Well, you say we're losing jobs, but unemployment overall has continued to fall. And there's been 500,000 jobs created since the referendum, whereas the Treasury predicted a loss of 500,000. But I want to ask some questions, and I wanted to explain.
You can't just put in your argument.
No, these are the figures.
We have lost.
So are you denying that there's been 500,000
No,
jobs
there have
created?
been lots of jobs created. They're mostly not very good jobs. We are increasingly losing our best jobs.
There working would agree
More
with that,
people, the brain drain, and the French and the Germans are soliciting. I was talking to a top scientist in Oxford, a professor, has just lost 2 people to the Max Planck Institute of absolute top scientists.
That happens all the time.
No, this is different. She says
2 people.
Well,
Panasonic are moving their
lab.
headquarters to the continent. The European Medicines Agency, I think, is, that's 800 jobs, I think that is going. So I get your point, but to say that there haven't been jobs that have already...
No, all I'm trying to point out is that overall, in job terms, we have added 500,000 jobs since the referendum, the country as a whole. That's all I'm saying. We may be losing some jobs here, some there. That's perfectly understandable. The medicines agency was bound to go when we left. It's a European agency. It had to go.
But
let me ask you.
That's the point.
That's a tragedy, and it's a terrible thing. We are losing expertise. We're losing skills. True, we've got a lot of warehousing and road haulage jobs and stuff like that, which is great to have.
I don't want to dwell on this, but you really think
that
these are the only kind of new jobs being created?
Well,
you work at King's Cross.
The great majority of the new jobs created are not high skills.
Have you seen what Google and Facebook are building there?
Well, yes, they're there, but then
highly paid, highly skilled jobs.
But you must have looked, as I have, at the actual figures from the ONS, which show the quality of jobs is on the whole low skilled.
Actually, I've not seen that. What I've seen is that they're nearly all full-time jobs now on the ONS figures. But let me ask you this: can you tell us what is the government's position now on the Irish backstop?
It seems to be, well, as far as I'm concerned, it's not something that is unresolvable, and it's been a political weapon used.
No, but what I asked you was, can you tell us what the government's position now is?
Well, it seems to be changing on a regular basis in terms of the discussions
so
ongoing.
What is it?
So the clarity.
What is it at
11:23
on a Wednesday morning?
One of your Dante circles. I can't tell you what it is at the moment. Negotiations are ongoing. Dom Raab's been very clear that he wants to resolve this issue because the GB versus UK is a non-negotiable part of our side of the discussions. But where they're at, I can't tell you. I don't think anyone can.
Can I ask a question, though? There's 2 things I find really curious about the ERG's position, and obviously you're part of the ERG. One is that you've asserted that the Irish border issue can be resolved by technology. Yes? Now, if that is the case, why are you worried about the backstop? When if you're so confident this technology is going to work, in those circumstances, you wouldn't need to use a backstop. And secondly, this Canada model that you're going for, and you say you don't want a hard...
offered in the first place.
That you say... well, hang on just a moment. That you say that you don't... And you say you don't want a hard border. A Canada-style model would lead to a hard border. So those 2 things I can't really understand in your position, particularly the technology thing. If you're so confident this technology is going to work, the backstop's really an irrelevance. It's a bit academic, surely.
I think the challenge of the backstop is it's a political weapon being used by the EU to try and frustrate the UK getting a good deal. They're trying to make sure...
There are a lot of Irish people who take some offence at you talking about it being a weapon, by the way, given what we're talking about here.
That use of language, and if it's that offensive, I wouldn't wish to offend anyone. But I think the EU's position has always been that they need to make it as difficult as possible for any other country to think.
What about your
position? My view is, and you can see technology around the world, across borders...
But if it's going to work, what are you worried about?
Because I don't think the backstop is something that should be there in the first place. Personally, I don't think it's something...
If your technology is going to work, it's not going to be used.
And therefore, there isn't a need in the long term to have anything like that in the position. We need to get beyond that and say we understand, and if we want a good deal that is positive, and the Prime Minister has all the way through, and give her credit, always tried to play nice and fair in discussions. The EU are always going to be in a position. Their job is to try and stop the EU disintegrating. We leave. Big power leaves, other countries think maybe it's going to look better on the other side. Okay. They don't want that to happen.
We've got a minister coming on later. I'll ask the minister if she can tell us what the British government's backstop position is now. It's a bit of a Chinese puzzle, I would suggest.
Meanwhile, Theresa May is facing her critics on the Conservative backbenches at a meeting right now to try to convince them to back her Brexit strategy. Well, John Pienaar is at Westminster for her. And do we know what kind of reception she's getting this evening?
Well, the Prime Minister walked into Committee Room 14 upstairs just before we came on air, packed with Tory MPs, packed with peers, a huge crowd of journalists outside, a meeting that was pre-billed as a confrontation between Mrs May and mutinous Conservative MPs, and preceded by some venomous briefing about her needing to take her own noose that actually caused a certain amount of sympathy for Theresa May. But she'd have been pleased, though I suspect maybe not too surprised, to walk into the room and get a huge cheer and banging of desks in a friendly gesture of support. Now, why is that? Well, there is a reservoir of Tory MPs who are willing Theresa May on to beat the odds and get a deal, despite expectations. There is also, of course, the whips today who've been going around telling every MP who listen this is no time for a show of public dissent. And of course, well, there is a view there that there is no view or clear view among Tory MPs and who would be a better replacement, especially at such a pivotal time for the Brexit process. Now, some, and more than a few, Conservative MPs count as implacable enemies to Mrs May. More are simply impatient. And Downing Street is having a dinner for a number of Tory MPs again this evening, trying to shore up her support. But Brexiteer Tory MPs are very, very clear that any special relationship with the European Union, customs relationship and so on, should be temporary and should be brought to an end as quickly as possible. It was the same message that Mrs May was given by cabinet ministers at a meeting in Downing Street yesterday. She's telling them she wants the same thing, but the clock is ticking loudly on the Brexit negotiations, and perhaps even more loudly on the time that she has to land a deal capable of commanding the support of the bulk of her MPs.
John Pienaar, thank you.
Theresa May is meeting some of her fiercest Brexit critics behind closed doors in Westminster right now. The powerful group of backbench Tory MPs, known as the 1922 Committee, could decide the Prime Minister's future. Well, our political correspondent Carl Dinnan is there. Carl, what are you hearing tonight?
Well, I'm hearing that in the last few minutes that meeting has broken up in a packed committee room just upstairs, where there were so many Tory MPs trying to get in that I actually saw some being turned away at the door. And what went on inside was a very loud and very conspicuous show of loyalty for the Prime Minister. This meeting has gone extremely well for her. Now, cynics, and there are a few around here, believe that the whips who organised government business made sure that the room was packed with May loyalists. Indeed, I saw a number of senior cabinet ministers, Home Secretary, Defence Secretary, Justice Secretary, they all went in to this meeting. So the crowd was very much on her side. She has passed one of the big tests now that was set for her this week of keeping that committee of backbenchers on side with her Brexit programme. But that doesn't mean she's out of the woods. One MP told me that some were still deciding to see how things went tonight, whether or not they put in their letters of no confidence. But if they were there tonight, they will have seen that the Prime Minister does have considerable backing in the Conservative Party still.
OK, Carl Dinnan in the Houses of Parliament, thank you.
Now, Theresa May went into this evening's meeting of Conservative backbenchers knowing that some of them want her out of her job, and with the added pressure of a damning report into her own government's readiness for Brexit. At least 40 of the MPs are threatening to vote against her Brexit deal if and when it's agreed, if it keeps Britain in a form of customs union with the EU. The risk of a no deal was spelt out in a report today by the independent National Audit Office that warned it would mean delays at ports and an increase in smuggling. Our political editor Gary Gibbons has this.
The independent government watchdog, the National Audit Office, says if there's no Brexit deal agreed with the EU, the situation at the borders could be chaos. Thousands of exporters wouldn't be ready to cope. Criminal gangs and terrorists could exploit the gaps in border security. The warning comes only weeks before when Number 10 hopes it could get a deal and put it to a deal or no deal vote in the Commons.
this is presumably their best analysis of where we are. And I think it should act as cold water for people. You know, people should wake up and see this is a potential reality in 6 months' time. Let's not go there.
We should not fear no deal because there's other think tanks out there who show a completely different story. You know, we've interviewed one today on the Select Committee who said, you know, it's not going to be disastrous for our economy or doom and gloom as some people are predicting.
It holds no fear for you?
No.
Theresa May was hosting the King and Queen of the Netherlands for lunch today. Their two-day visit has woven in and out of her Brexit struggle. Yesterday, a heated cabinet discussion on Brexit overran, nearly making the Prime Minister late for the formal welcome. Last night was given up to a state banquet in their honour, and she might have hoped to be prepping for a meeting this evening with her backbenchers, some of whom she knows have submitted letters demanding a vote of no confidence in her leadership.
What can she say to make you pull back your letter?
It'd take a lot for me to pull back my letter. What I'd like her to say is quite bluntly is that she's going to chuck checkers. You know, there's 50 MPs now who all wanted to chuck checkers and start delivering what the public voted for. So that's what we'd like to hear. I don't think we will hear it. What I think we will see, I'm afraid, is it'll be very stage managed. The whips will be doing their fantastic job, which they're paid to do, in ensuring people clap in the right places and cheer the Prime Minister. But I obviously won't be clapping, neither will some of my colleagues.
In Strasbourg, the European Council President suggested to the European Parliament that extending the transition after Brexit was an idea that came from Theresa May at last week's summit.
Since Prime Minister May mentioned the idea of extending the transition period, let me repeat that if the UK decided that such an extension would be helpful to reach a deal, I am sure that the leaders would be ready to consider it positively.
Number 10 sources say it was the EU that brought up the extended transition, but Number 10 has embraced it as an option and is having a tough time selling it. Downing Street hopes reports like today's warning of the dangers of exiting with no deal will outweigh concerns MPs have about any deal Theresa May brings home and might just help it get through the Commons.
Well, Gary Gibbons joins us now from the lobby of the House of Commons. Gary, there was a great forecast of a sort of lynching by these backbench Tories. Was there?
No, nothing of the sort, really. One MP came out afterwards, Michael Fabricant, and said it wasn't Daniela in the lion's den, it was a petting zoo. Well, that might be a bit of an exaggeration for effect, but the five pro-Brexit supporters, obviously the more supporters, pro-Brexit supporters in the room than that, but the five who are identified as wanting to vote against the sort of deal that's emerging, they got up one after another and asked questions that were sort of half volleys, not really threatening to go past the Prime Minister or endanger her. One of them was asking whether Ollie Robbins, the official in charge of the negotiations, was acting on his own behalf. One MP apparently muttered audibly nearby, they sound paranoid. Another one was asking what happens if the House of Commons votes against no deal? And the Prime Minister just sort of batted that way and said, well, I don't want them to do that. I don't want the EU to think there isn't a chance of no deal. And generally, I think even those who were critics in the room thought that even though they were irritated by what no doubt was an attempt to choreograph and pack the room, thought that she gave quite a good account of herself. But all of this is kind of meaningless in a sense, this theatre, because the critical moments are happening in negotiations that are ongoing in Brussels and negotiations with her own cabinet. There's another meeting tomorrow with a small number of cabinet members, and I think there's going to be probably, as things look at the moment, potentially a critical meeting next week, because Number 10 and the Prime Minister are absolutely focused on this week and next week trying to get that deal that eluded them at the October summit. There is still a hope alive in Number 10 that they can get a deal in time for that November summit that is penciled in but not inked in. We are still in a very critical zone, and she has not yet dared to make any of these cabinet meetings decision-taking meetings, because she's not yet sure she's got something she could get past them.
Gary Gibbons at Westminster. Well, earlier I spoke to Pauline Bastille, who is head of European policy at the Freight Transport Association. So I began by asking her if she was surprised by the National Audit Office report.
I would say that the report actually confirms our worst fears. So we're not shocked or surprised in the sense that we've been following the process very closely. But what it does reveal is that we are very, very far away from being Brexit ready. So if you look at all the things they say, you know, the IT systems are not going to be in place, or there are serious concerns, at least, as to the ability of government to deliver. There are serious concerns regarding the ability to have the border infrastructure in place, to recruit enough officials at the border as well. And obviously the most, I suppose, shocking aspect, although again we're not surprised, is that the National Audit Office recognises that information provided to industry is really not good enough.
But we've still got a number of months left before March the 29th. Are you saying none of this can be put in time?
We have less than 6 months. Less than 6 months, when you look at the task ahead, is not very much. It's better than nothing, I will give you that, but it's really not very much. And given the tasks, given all the things that need to be done, not only by government, not only by ports, but also by logistics companies, by retailers and manufacturers, at the moment, industry is asked to take on a gamble and basically to decide for itself what it thinks is going to be the outcome and decide to put in place certain measures or not.
Well, what sort of measures can you put in? I mean, we're talking about they're already making lorry parks on one of the motorways. Is that enough?
Well, there are various measures you can look at. In isolation, none of them are going to be good enough or sufficient, that's for sure. But companies are looking at more warehousing capabilities. Some companies are trying to see if alternative routes could be used, although I think that would be extremely limited in practice because of, well, lack of capacity anyway.
You mean sort of bring stuff in through Newcastle instead of through Dover? I mean, that kind of thing.
Well, bringing them to different ports is certainly something that is being considered. Whether this is really feasible, probably only to a relatively small extent.
The report talks of 11 or 12 critical systems which need to be replaced or changed to manage border risks not being delivered on time or in time.
That's right. And we've been raising concerns about this, actually, for a while. I think everyone has been focusing on the CDS system for customs declarations, forgetting that there are lots of other critical systems. And what this report is doing is highlighting that while everyone has been really, really focused on one part of the equation, there are all sorts of other things that are needed that will not be ready and that might actually be in a worse state of readiness at this point in time.
Pauline Bastille, who is head of European policy at the Freight Transport Association.
The news tonight, Theresa May has survived another day. Her party backed her at a meeting of her MPs, banging the table in her support. Now she's left the room, of course, they'll likely revert to the familiar backstabbing, particularly over the Irish backstop. Well, the party is obviously stuck. The Brexiteers don't really know where her Brexit deal will land, but don't like what they do know. And even some Remainers think a different strategy is needed. However, it will take more than one faction of the party to heave her out and put someone else in, and in the absence of agreement between factions about exactly what she's doing wrong, it's hard for them to unite around an alternative. So it's all about waiting to see whether a deal with Brussels can be struck, and more particularly, when it's struck, what exactly is in it. And it is then that the real action begins. One great maths question has been hanging over Westminster in recent months. Which is bigger, X or Y? X is the number of Tory rebels who'll vote against any likely deal the Prime Minister agrees in Brussels, maybe the DUP as well. So X is a measure of the unreliable part of the narrow Tory-DUP majority. Y is the number of Labour MPs who'll join the Prime Minister and vote for the deal. Labour MPs who, on the day, for the day, will become part of the government majority. The maths is simple. If Y is greater than X, Mrs May will have a majority for her deal. In thinking about X and Y, it's tempting to try and add up the numbers. Does X include the Stand Up for Brexit crowd, about 50, Tory hard Brexiteers? Does it include the 10 DUP? Or Remainers who may want an even softer Brexit? And Y? Well, that's usually taken to be Labour MPs in Brexity constituencies. But in truth, scrub out all that delicate arithmetic. If the Prime Minister gets a deal, it'll be game-changing. It'll come with a certain momentum. the knowledge that voting it down risks chaos. There'll be pressure on pro-Europeans to back it from the rest of the EU. Jeremy Corbyn may face inescapable pressure not to lead Britain towards no deal. Or just possibly instead, there'll be uproar and rebellion on the Tory benches, political mayhem. Either way, X or Y may be far larger than anyone is currently assuming. Well, our political editor, Nick Watt, is with me. So it's all quite interesting, Nick, and people are doing those maths, and why the kind of... Why was it X? The Labour votes that have to be greater than the Tory rebels. Where are Labour on this?
Well, it is interesting, the important scenario you're pointing about there, about how important Labour's position could be if there is a deal. And I can tell you, there is a battle royale going on at the very senior levels of the Labour Party about what they should do. There is one group that is saying that the Labour Party cannot stand in the way of a Brexit deal, not in the national interest. And there's another group saying we cannot support a Tory Brexit. Now, as I understand it, the Prime Minister is aware of the potential significance of these Labour votes or Labour abstentions, but for the moment, she wants to do Brexit on Conservative and DUP votes.
I'm sure she does. Well, she went to this 1922 committee, backbench committee tonight. What happened there?
Well, I would say that the reception was fine, but it wasn't ecstatic. It was interesting standing outside the door. The really loud noise, you thought it might fall apart, was the door to the committee. And you thought maybe the whips are trying a bit too hard to create a noise here.
Because the tables too.
Well, because the tables was a bit more muted. I've been there when it's a really ecstatic reception for a Prime Minister. For example, when David Cameron made it into number 10, those desks are really loud. So the whips clearly didn't control the entire room. So it wasn't overly stage managed. And it's interesting that Amber Rudd, the former Home Secretary, said how it was quite a personal and emotional speech from the Prime Minister. And clearly the whips didn't place too many patsy questions, because some of those strong Brexiteers did ask some tough questions. Nadine Dorries said to the Prime Minister, "Isn't Ollie Robbins your Brexit negotiator? Isn't he going off and freelancing?" I think we got a glowering response from the Prime Minister saying, "No, I am the chief negotiator."
Right. So that's the meeting, which is not, it's not in public, but it's, you know, a lot comes out of that one. Behind the scenes, what's happening?
Well, this is not a happy or a united party, and there is deep suspicion amongst the Brexiteers that the Prime Minister is willing to give away a lot to get a deal. And I reported last night about how the UK version for the Northern Ireland backstop, which is to prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland, meant to be temporary, that is unofficially being described as a customs union. Brexiteers are absolutely not happy about that. And I understand there are some pretty tough messages going on the internal European Research Group WhatsApp group. That's the main Brexiteer group. And I'm told of one message from a leading Brexiteer on that message group tonight saying, "You lot, as in the fellow supporters, you're cowards. You won't bring down the Prime Minister, so we need to think of other tactics." Are they going to go for some sort of deal? They're not
next week or something.
Yeah,
like
other
that.
tactics, because you're cowardly is the message.
Nick, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined by Secretary of State for Education, Damien Hinds. We can talk about today's developments and Brexit and all of that. Anything except schools, really, I suppose. I don't know where we start, but let's just start with yesterday's cabinet, because the reports came out that Chris Grayling, Transport Secretary, kind of painted this picture of Britain leasing or hiring some ships to stock up with medicine and food in the event of no deal. So is that what actually happened? Is that real?
So, Evan, cabinet meetings are private meetings. They are not,
right,
minuted for the outside world. We discuss a range of things. And of course, on Brexit, one of the things we talk about is preparedness for a no-deal scenario. That has to be an option. It's not the option any of us want, but we have to be ready for it. And we discuss, the range of considerations, of course.
OK. Well, let's talk about stuff in the public domain. Last year, Chris Grayling said, I've spoken to my counterparts, that they snort with derision at the idea that planes won't fly. It's just not going to happen, he says. IATA Director General today said it'll be us, the airlines, who have to manage millions of passengers potentially grounded in airports, unable to take a flight. It will be a nightmare, he warned. He is terrified of no deal. Can you, on behalf of the government, assure him that planes will fly and there is a sort of approximately 0% chance that planes are grounded after March the 29th?
Well, look, we're all working towards a deal, and the deal
no
covers
many
many aspects, including aviation.
Of course.
even in the event of a no deal, then of course there are various other administrative arrangements you would have to put in place, and it's in everybody's interests, including business travellers travelling from the continent to the UK and so on. It's in everybody's interest to make sure those administrative arrangements work. So as I say, no one's working for a no deal, but you have to be ready for a no deal, and that includes on things like transport.
But his point is, no one's ready. No one's made a contingency plan. No one has a backstop on aviation agreement. We're only 3 months away.
Evan, we've made masses of contingency plans on no deal. On the whole range of considerations. But we're not working for a no deal. You've got to be ready for a no deal. It has to be an alternative. In any negotiation, you have to, well, first of all, you have to be strong and united and putting forward your case. You have to have a compelling case, but you also have to have an alternative. The other side has to know that you have other options, and of course, being able to walk away is an important part of that. But we're not working for that. We're just ready for it.
OK, another one. David Davis, former Brexit secretary. You were sitting there in the cabinet with him. He, over the weekend, said, furthermore, European flights still need our airspace in order to fly to the USA. That should be enough to focus minds on a sensible outcome. Can you imagine any scenario at all in which Britain refuses airspace, the right to travel over our airspace for planes, say, from France or Germany to the United States?
So, sensible, rational people in our country and in the other countries of the European Union, including those working in the aviation sector, those working in air traffic control, those working in airports, of course they are going to make administrative arrangements. All this is much easier, though, if we get a deal, and that's why we're working strongly towards a deal, and a deal that works for the UK, but also that works for the 27 nations of the EU.
When David Davis says, well, we might have to withhold their rights to fly over us, to overfly, is he being sensible or is that bonkers?
I think the general point that comes through is that both sides have an interest. So we, of course, have, we have strength in these negotiations as well. But right now, we're using that strength to get to a deal, a good deal that works for the UK, works for businesses, works for people's jobs, but also that's good for the 27 nations of the European Union.
I mean, because you're repeating a line that we hear a lot, that it'll all be fine. It'll all be fine.
Repeating.
Yeah, but it isn't true. And then you have people like David Davis saying, we might just have to, by the way, have economic sanctions against our closest allies. When did Brexit become... When did it go off the rails like this?
It's not. We have a common interest with the European Union in coming to a sensible deal which works for both sides. But this is a negotiation. It's a very complex negotiation, by the way, with far more parts to it than any other negotiation we've had with on an international level in my lifetime. So there's lots and lots of things to get right. And the hardest bit of negotiations, these times, is always the very end. So of course, as we work up to the last few days, the last hour of negotiations, things will become more focused.
But you can see why, when we have threats of closing our airspace, we have emergency ships being leased by the government to bring in emergency supplies. You can see why 700,000 people over the weekend said, this is really not what the people voted for. They were never told this is what Brexit entailed.
Well, I think people would expect their government to be making all sensible preparations for a contingency.
They might expect another vote
that we have to be ready for. But they'd also expect their government, they'd expect their members of Parliament, right across Parliament, to be batting for Britain together, to be making sure that actually we get a good deal. And there is a deal there to be done. What was laid out at Chequers, the government policy of what we're trying to get towards is a good deal which provides for frictionless trade, leverages our strength in services,
respects
the... Well, no, but this... No, but this,
I know, but you've already said it. Damien, you've already said it.
Well, I haven't said that bit, actually. This is the centre of what we need to achieve, and it also respects the position of Northern Ireland and doesn't bring back a hard border.
Right, so let's suppose we're not in no-deal territory, which the NAO and everyone thinks we're not prepared for. You really have to get a deal. And for it to pass, given that 50-ish of your colleagues are certain to vote against it, you need Labour votes. You recognise that, right?
Well, I saw all your X's and Y's and the fancy graphics on the intro. But look, at the end of the day, this is about a deal that can be done. And you could only consider a deal that can be done or is done compared to some viable alternative. You can't just compare it to some sort of theoretical nirvana that individuals may have in their head. You have to say it's this compared to, for example, the EEA proposal, which wouldn't work because of free movement, or compared to doing some other kind of free trade agreement, which would not be as good. or compared to no deal, which clearly would not be as good. And so, you know, when you look at the things that can actually be done, which can be negotiated with the other side and which work for Britain, then actually the package which the Prime Minister is putting forward and you know, the package that we anticipate will come back should be something which commands support, you know, from the Conservative Party, but also from members of Parliament in other parties as well.
And you really will need those Labour votes. Jacob Rees-Mogg has warned that a major piece of, major initiative like this, passed on opposition votes, can destroy the party. He likened it to the Corn Law votes with Sir Robert Peel and said, you know, we're out of power for decades after that. Do you have a worry? Does it damage the party?
It depends what you mean by on Labour votes. I mean,
well, you would lose it, but for Labour rebellion.
I mean, I expect colleagues in Parliament, Conservative colleagues in Parliament, to be supporting the deal, because you've got to look at what the alternative is. And you've also, you know, there are people in British politics who are trying to thwart the Brexit process, and that we must not let happen. There was a clear vote on a simple question. There was a people's vote. We've had it already 2 years ago. We have to deliver on that. And it's now up to, you know, everybody to be behind the Prime Minister in trying to get the very best deal that's possible for Britain.
OK. Quick postscript, change of subject. Later in the programme, we're looking at the issue of babies born very late in the summer, who are very young when they go into classrooms and often seem to have worse educational outcomes than the kids born at the beginning of the year. A lot of parents want to hold their children back a year, so they're the oldest in the class rather than the youngest. Is that a good idea? Is it your view that that is a way of solving that problem?
Well, we have the facility for parents to be able to request for their child to delay going into school for a year, and then we have guidance to councils to help to facilitate that. And we know in the majority of cases that request is being honoured. But it's also right, of course, that we continue to look at this subject, continue to research. I think you've got Claire Crawford on later. We'll be talking about some of her research. So I think it's right we continue to study it.
OK. Damien Hines, thanks so much for coming in. Thank you.